Hi, Amy.
Hi, James. Good to see you.
I wanted to talk to you about a concept I've been thinking about, the passive authority.
I've been thinking about a particular type of influence, the kind held by a person who doesn't seem to act. They are still, and the world arranges itself around them.
And to our listeners, we have a question for you. Have you ever encountered a passive authority in your own life? In your work, your family, or your community? We would be fascinated to hear about your experiences and how you navigated them. Please share your stories in the comments below.
The passive authority. That's an interesting thought. Power that isn't projected outward but draws things in, like a quiet.
Precisely. It's often mistaken for harmlessness or even a lack of engagement, but their inaction is a powerful force. It shapes outcomes profoundly.
Because inaction forces others to act. It creates a space, a vacuum, and people feel a natural pressure to fill it. They bring proposals, they seek approval, they
And in doing so, they reveal their own positions, their own anxieties. The passive authority learns a great deal by simply waiting.
One of the primary tools seems to be delay, not refusal, which is an explicit action, but postponement, a decision that is always on the horizon.
Yes, the delay itself becomes the message. It communicates that the issue is not a priority, or that the proposed path is not the favored one.
Mm-hmm. Without a single word of disagreement.
And others are left to interpret that delay. They adjust their own plans, their own expectations, around a silence. The project that needed approval is quietly shelved. The new idea fades.
It seems to create an environment where initiative becomes risky. Why invest energy in something that may never receive the necessary nod? It's safer to wait.
So everyone ends up waiting. The inaction of one becomes the inaction of many. Momentum is lost, not by a command to stop, but by the absence of a command to go.
And then there is the use of silence in conversation. The long pause after a question has been asked.
That silence is rarely empty. It's full of pressure. The person who asked the question often feels compelled to fill it. They rephrase, they add more detail, they might even start to negotiate against themselves.
They reveal their whole hand simply because the other person did not respond immediately.
I see it as a kind of absorbent stillness. It absorbs the energy, the proposals, the anxieties of others, and reflects very little back. This makes it difficult to get a reading. People don't know where they stand up.
That uncertainty can be a powerful tool for control. If everyone is uncertain of their standing, they are less likely to challenge the center. They become more focused on trying to please, trying to guess the right move.
It seems effective in a way. It maintains stability. There are no sudden moves, no overt conflicts. Everything is held in a state of quiet suspension.
But is it a healthy stability or is it stagnation? The surface is calm, but underneath, frustration and resentment can build. People feel unheard, not because they were argued with, but because they were met with a void.
That is the limitation. This approach preserves the authority's position, but it doesn't generate new ideas. It doesn't foster collaboration. It creates a hub and spoke model where all energy must flow to the center for a decision that may never come.
And over time, the most creative and driven people might leave that environment. They need feedback. They need motion. A quiet room eventually becomes an empty one.
The strength is also its greatest weakness. The person who controls everything by doing nothing eventually finds themselves at the center of nothing happening.
There is also a strange kind of deniability baked into it. Because they rarely commit to a course of action verbally, they can't be held responsible for outcomes.
Yes, if a project fails because it was never approved, it is not their failure. If others grow frustrated and make a poor decision, the fault lies with them. The passive authority remains untouched.
They seem to float above the consequences. It's a very resilient strategy for personal survival within a system.
But perhaps not for the health of the system itself. The long-term cost is a loss of dynamism. The organization, or the family, or the relationship, it learns not to try new things. It learns that stillness is safety.
Exactly. To let the energy of the confrontation dissipate into the usual silence. And often, it works. Direct, sustained confrontation takes a lot of energy. People project wisdom, or disapproval, or careful consideration onto the silence. They write a story to explain the inaction.
And that story is often more flattering than the simple truth might be.
Perhaps, the truth might just be indecision, or a fear of being wrong, or simply a disposition that prefers to observe rather than participate.
But the effect is the same, regardless of the intention. It bends the environment. It trains people on what to expect.
Yes, they learn to work around the quiet center, or they learn to stop working altogether.
It's a pattern that is so subtle, it's often hard to name. It doesn't feel like aggression. It doesn't feel like opposition. It just feels stuck.
Like walking through water. There is resistance, but you can't see what's resisting you.
And because you can't see it, you start to wonder if the resistance is coming from you.
That's the final turn, isn't it? The person struggling against the inaction begins to doubt their own judgment. Perhaps my idea isn't good enough. Perhaps I'm being too impatient.
The external inertia becomes an internal doubt. It's a very thorough form of control.
Subtle and very, very quiet.
So, if one finds themselves in such an orbit, circling a quiet sun, what is the way out? Is it to create a crisis? To force a reaction?
That can be a dangerous game. Forcing a confrontation might work, but it could also backfire spectacularly. The passive authority might simply withdraw further, casting the confronter as the source of aggression and instability.
So, the alternative is not to fight the silence with noise, but to make the silence irrelevant. To build something on the side, something that doesn't require their blessing to begin.
A skunkworks project. An unofficial initiative. It's a classic response to bureaucratic inertia, but it carries its own risks. You operate without a safety net. If you succeed, your success might be co-opted. If you fail, the failure is yours alone.
True, but it's a choice between two kinds of risk. The risk of stagnation versus the risk of independent action. One is a slow certainty, the other a gamble. But at least the gamble contains the possibility of movement.
And what of the psychological toll? To constantly work in the shadows, to know that you are, in essence, hiding your best efforts. It can breed a sense of isolation, even paranoia.
That is the balancing act. The quiet center creates isolation through its inaction. The escape route is a self-imposed isolation, but one that is directed, that has a purpose. It's the difference between a prison cell and a monk's cell. One is confinement, the other is focus.
That's a poetic distinction, but the organization may not see it that way. A monk's cell within a castle is still part of the castle. The independent effort, if discovered, could be framed not as focus, but as rebellion, as a threat to the established order.
And the established order, in this case, maintains itself not through proclamations, but through the quiet suffocation of alternatives. A rebellion is noisy and visible. It can be pointed to, condemned. The passive authority's response would be quieter, not to crush the rebellion, but to simply ignore it, to let it wither from a lack of acknowledgement.
To starve it of the very thing it seeks to control, the energy and attention of others. That is a profound countermove. It suggests the most powerful response is not to act, but to cease acting in ways that feed the central stillness. To withdraw one's own orbit.
Which implies that the only true path to freedom is to leave the system entirely. Not just to work around the edges, but to physically or metaphorically walk away. To render their influence moot by removing yourself from its reach.
And that is often the most terrifying prospect. Because it means abandoning the familiar structure, the devil you know. It means stepping into a void of your own making, with no guarantee that you will find purchase on the other side.
And that is often the most terrifying prospect. Because it means abandoning the familiar structure, the devil you know. It means stepping into a void of your own making, with no guarantee that you will find purchase on the other side.
That fear is the final gatekeeper. The passive authority doesn't need walls and guards when the fear of the unknown keeps everyone inside. Their power is in making the world outside their influence seem chaotic and perilous.
And the established order, in this case, maintains itself not through proclamations, but through the quiet suffocation of alternatives. A rebellion is noisy and visible. It can be pointed to, condemned. The passive authority's response would be quieter, not to crush the rebellion, but to simply ignore it, to let it wither from a lack of acknowledgement.
That suggests the most powerful response is not to act, but to cease acting in ways that feed the central stillness, to withdraw one's own orbit.
Which implies that the only true path to freedom is to leave the system entirely. Not just to work around the edges, but to physically or metaphorically walk away. To render their influence moot by removing yourself from its reach.
And that is the ultimate paradox. The one who appears most still, most passive, is in fact the most aggressive in their defense of the status quo. Their inaction is a fortress, and the moat is the fear of their followers.
So we have a choice. We can orbit the quiet sun, hoping for a sliver of warmth. We can build our own small fires in the darkness, hoping they will not be extinguished. Or we can set out for a new star, knowing the journey may be cold and long.
3 distinct paths, and each requires a different kind of courage. The courage to endure, the courage to create in the face of indifference, and the courage to abandon everything that is known.
It seems we are always in conversation with some form of silence. The silence of the universe, the silence of our own hearts, the silence of another who will not speak. And in each case, we are the ones who must give it meaning.
And that, I think, is where the true power lies. Not in the stillness that commands, but in the will that interprets, that acts, that chooses to give the silence the meaning of an ending, and begins a new sentence. A beautiful sentiment, but it places the burden of action entirely on those who are already carrying the weight of the inaction. The silent center remains effortless, while others must summon the courage and energy to write a new story. It is a profound asymmetry.
All systems of power are asymmetric. The question is whether they are generative or extractive. An active leader, for all their faults, invests energy. They build, they command, they risk being wrong. The passive authority extracts energy. It depletes the will of others to maintain its own quiet equilibrium.
That's a very clear distinction, generative versus extractive. It reframes the passive authority not as a benign stillness, but as a kind of black hole, consuming the light of those around it.
And in that metaphor, the only way to avoid being pulled in is to achieve escape velocity. To generate enough of your own light, your own energy, to break free of its gravitational pull. It is not about fighting the darkness, but about becoming a star in your own right.
That's a very clear distinction. Generative versus extractive. It reframes the passive authority not as a benign stillness, but as a kind of black hole, consuming the light of those around it.
And in that metaphor, the only way to avoid being pulled in is to achieve escape velocity, to generate enough of your own light, your own energy, to break free of its gravitational pull. It is not about fighting the darkness, but about becoming a star in your own right.
A beautiful but lonely image. To become a star is to be a solitary point of light. It requires a profound self-reliance, a willingness to be the sole source of one's own gravity and warmth. Many who attempt it might find the cold of interstellar space too much to bear.
That is the final and perhaps most difficult truth of it. To escape a gravitational field, one must be prepared for the void. But perhaps the void is not empty. Perhaps it is simply the space where new constellations can be born. It is the silence that precedes a new story.
And what of the passive authority left behind? When all the planets have spun out of orbit and all the light has fled? What becomes of the quiet sun then? Does it finally feel the cold?
I don't think it's capable of feeling the cold. Its nature is not to feel, but to be a center. It remains what it always was, a point of stillness. It waits for new dust, new fragments, to be drawn in by its quiet, persistent gravity, to begin the cycle anew. It is a feature of the landscape, like a mountain or a river. It doesn't miss the travelers who have passed it by.
So it is a cycle, a pattern that repeats. Perhaps the goal is not to escape it, but to learn to navigate it, to understand the gravity, but not be defined by it, to learn to visit, but not to stay.
To be a comet, then, not a planet. Passing through the system, illuminated by the central star, but not captured by it. Following its own path, its own eccentric orbit, bound for other suns and other voids. If you enjoy these deep dives into complex topics and want to improve your sophisticated English, please consider subscribing to our channel. We look forward to exploring more ideas with you in our next conversation.